Hello, welcome, and good morning. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read-Along. My name is Neil Parekh. I am the executive producer and guest host of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read-Along. We took a week off for Easter, and it feels like it was much longer, but it was only 2 weeks ago since we last saw you. Our guest this week is Andrew Revkin, who's with the Earth Institute. He's a longtime environment and climate change journalist. He was formerly with the New York Times, the National Geographic Society, and ProPublica. Our host, of course, is Srinivasan, the Marshall Loeb Professor at the Stony Brook School of Journalism and co-founder of Digimentors. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We're also live on Andrew's Facebook page and his Twitter account. Thank you for that, Andrew. We have a great show planned for today. Let's take a look at who's joining us so far. Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar is joining us. It's a rainy morning in the New York City area. I'm based here in Springfield, Virginia, just outside DC, Washington, DC. It's a gorgeous day today, so hopefully you'll get some sun later up on the East Coast. Jonathan Borstein is joining us from the East Village, and Rajni Kotecha joining us from Toronto. Diane Stefani joining us from Margate. Our friend Patricia Freudenberg also joining us from New York, watching on LinkedIn. Hi, Mom. My mom appreciate it, watching from Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. Adam Glenn is joining from Sleepy Hollow, also in Westchester County. Doug Levy woke up early to join us from San Francisco. Thank you, Doug. Laura Silverman joining us from Philadelphia. And Gunther Baylor joining us from Vienna, Austria. Of course, we have a international audience every week. And without further ado, I'm going to have Srinivasan join us on the stage. Sri, good morning. How are you, Sri? Good to see you.
Great to be here, and thank you for everything you do to make this so much fun and a great part of my Sunday morning, but also the Sunday morning of so many people around the world. Everyone, tell us where you're watching from. Tell us how your Sunday is going, and thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Thank you, Sri. What I'd like to do is to start off by thanking our production team. We wouldn't be able to put on the New York Times Read Along every week with the quality that we can without the great team, in addition to Sri and myself. Paula Kiger, Steve Taylor, Julia Weeks, and Carla Baranauckas are integral to the success of the New York Times Read Along. You can follow them at Big Green Pen, at Steve DeReeve, at Julia Weeks, and at Kabara. So please know that they're going to be dropping in links to articles, answering questions, and just engaging with the audience. Steve is going to be watching on Andrew's Facebook page as well. So again, for folks who are joining us, who may not be familiar with the show, we read the New York Times every Sunday with special guests, and we have staff that help curate links, answer questions, and of course, Srinivasan is the host of our show.
And I'm so excited that we have Andy Revkin today. He's been someone I've admired and gotten to know over the years, and he's got a great new life at Columbia's Earth Institute and runs a webcast and does so much more. So you're going to learn so much from him, everybody. One of the great environmental journalists of our times, and so much for us to talk about with him.
Absolutely. And we have several more people who have checked in. So just want to say hi to Linda Lawrence from Long Island and Ramnath from Bangalore. Susanna Spear is watching from Denver. It's also early out in Colorado. Our friend Stephen Kaplan watching from Ramsey, New Jersey. Naomi Service from the Upper West Side. Ashok Motwani from Mumbai. And Robin watching from Fort Lee, New Jersey, just across the river from you, Sri, and where my sister has an apartment. So I know the view very well. And Susanna is sharing that the last time she heard Andrew speak was at Story Collider. So we'll want to hear a little bit about that later. But before we go there, Sri, can you tell our audience a little bit about Digimentors, the hybrid events and virtual events consulting firm that you co-founded?
We're so delighted that we can work with this incredible team at Digimentors. We do social and digital consulting, conferences, summits, and talk shows like this. So if you are interested in anything like this, please get in touch with us. Our website is digimentors.group, digimentors.group, or email Neil or email me, and we'd love to talk to you. We work with organizations big and small around the world, virtual events and hybrid events as well. So do get in touch with us.
And again, if you're interested, you can reach Sri at digimentors.group to learn how we can produce a show like this for you. And one of the projects that we're doing through Digimentors is a great conference called Social Media Weekend. We very quickly moved the conference online last year as the pandemic was spreading and New York shut down. We had about 10 days lead time to switch the conference. We didn't cancel it. March 21st was the conference last year, and that really helped launch this new iteration of Digimentors and a lot of the work. And I joined Digimentors full time back in August as the VP of Events and Communications.
Sri, this year's conference is going to be terrific. It's May 21st and 22nd, the 21st evening. It's a Friday night, and most of Saturday. It'll be recorded, so if you can't watch, you can go on, you will be able to see a recording. SM Weekend, you can see there, smwknd.com to get tickets, and there's early bird special there. So hope you will tell anybody you know who's interested in digital topics, social media topics, and how to grow your audience, connect with people around the world, build your digital profile. This will be an awesome conference, not because of me, because of all the people who work on the conference, and we'll have speakers, world-class speakers who will be there as we've done this now for a decade. So we're thrilled to do this. So please check out smwknd.com.
Absolutely. And with that, Sri, let's take a quick look at the newspaper, the Sunday paper that we have out that you have today. And we'll get a preview of what's to come.
Sure, and then we'll be going right to meet Andrew Revkin. So everyone, please tell us where you're watching from and tell us about your Sunday. Let's just take a look. The Sunday Style section has a cover story that the headline is, "You Will Pay to Be Humiliated, the High-Priced Hustle of Financial Domination," where clients send tributes to their cash masters. This person identifies herself as a financial dominatrix. There's an Andrew on the cover of Sunday Review. Wait, could Andrew Yang really be New York City's next mayor? The Metropolitan cover is Toxic Clash over the city's future. And one of the fascinating things about Andrew Revkin's career is that he was the first regional environmental correspondent for the New York Times, covering this region here. The at-home cover is We're Finding the Wild Things Around Us. And the real estate cover is a reverse migration. Suburban homeowners who have profited from the urban exodus during the pandemic are leaving small town life behind. So I didn't know that was happening. The arts and leisure cover, Keeping Love Close, Framing Intimacy in a Time of Hate and Violence. And this has a terrific essay by Celeste Ng, the author, and just a look at how Asian American photographers documenting what's happening. The book review cover is His Life as a Man, Philip Roth's biography by Blake Bailey. And the cover of the New York Times Magazine is What Does America Owe Immigrants from Countries that have been destabilized by U.S. foreign policy? That's a lot of countries. And the headline here is A Forgotten Promise. The Sunday Business cover is about the newspapers. And there's a terrific article about the Wall Street Journal by Edmund Lee. And for billionaires, ownership offers status and a worthy mission. Their money offers salvation. So that's the cover of Sunday Business. And of course, the love of newspapers is why we've been doing this for 5 years. And I will just glance at the front page here, and then we'll get right to Andy. The lead story in the paper is Young Migrants Crowd Shelters and Test for Biden, March Influx a Record, asking NASA workers to go on leave to help with childcare. So this is obviously a big issue that we can touch upon. And here's a look at one of the variants, and it's dominating cases in Europe and the sweep of a dangerous virus variant across Europe. And this is a fascinating story. They saw their teacher marching to the Capitol. Beloved educator's extreme politics set off fierce debate in her hometown in California. For this surge, Whitmer takes hands-off tack. This is Governor Whitmer in the most dangerous place for the pandemic right now is in the state of Michigan, but she is not going for another lockdown. And this is a story about Governor DeSantis in Florida becoming the Trump heir, and he's at the top of the non-Trump 2024 candidates list. That's if Trump doesn't run, he's expected to be the front runner. Afghan security fears mount as leaders' influence withers. And this is about President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan Center in Kabul in 2019. So we're going to review the paper, how this works, everyone, as Andy's going to come in, and then we're going to chat with him a little bit, and then we'll talk about the New York Times, read through the news. We'll take your comments and read them on the air. And we're live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So please share this with your friends and family. They can watch live or they can watch later when they get a chance. So just tag someone who enjoys the news, who'd like to hear from Andy, and you will get a chance to share that with your friends. And Linda says the visual data on variants is scary. That is absolutely right. So with that, let's put our cover back on the screen so everyone can see who our very special guest is today. And that is Andrew Revkin, founding director of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. He's the host of the Sustain What webcast, and he's a longtime environment and climate change journalist. He was formerly at the New York Times, National Geographic Society, and ProPublica. So everyone, please welcome Andy Revkin.
Good morning, Sri. And team. It's great to be here. It really is.
And so great to see you here and to have you here. You're someone who has done such great work through the pandemic. But I always ask, how are you doing? How's your family been handling the pandemic? Where are you on the vaccination schedule?
Yeah, well, we live in the Hudson Valley, in the little village of Nelsonville, and Lenape territory, which I always cherish the backstory behind landscapes that we kind of take for granted sometimes. We are all doing really well. I fully vaccinated as of almost 2 weeks ago, so I should be pretty much immune. My wife is almost there. Her second shot's tomorrow. My 23-year-old son here is halfway through. My 30-year-old son in LA is not yet vaccinated. He had COVID. He has a different frame of reference on some of these issues. Like so many people in America, we have a divided country on, even within my family, we have differences on how to handle this situation, which is kind of distressing, but it says a lot to me about the behavioral and social context around stories that we think of as science.
Sure. And of course, no bigger science story than the pandemic at the moment. But you're someone who has been covering climate change. And the pandemic is also a story in part about how the world is changed over these last few decades. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, it's, we live on a small planet and we are now up to 7.8 billion people and we have global commerce. So everything we do is interconnected. When I was writing my blog at the time, so I'm sure we'll talk about that later, in 2009, when the avian virus was the significant peril, I did a piece about essentially the concept of one health, that we think of human health distinct from environmental and health, ecological health, and it's all interrelated. So when you have species being marketed and crowded situations in Chinese markets, that's connected to everybody's health ultimately, as we found out all the way through last year, and even a little bit that end of the last year before this pandemic year was when that virus was starting to jump ship essentially. And the climate is the same kind of thing. It's not connected virally, but we all share one atmosphere. So a molecule of heat trapping CO2 leaving a smokestack in Beijing or a car exhaust in Texas or down the street from me, they all go into the atmosphere and circulate and are changing the general global climate, and that has implications for everyone.
Do you have hope that maybe one of the consequences of the pandemic is that people will take climate change more seriously?
No. I think we're still very much a here and now species, and climate is, despite the recent trauma in the West with wildfire, for example, we still tend to be focused on things that are here and now. And the other thing that I learned in reporting on the behavioral contexts around these issues is that stress around an issue leads you to become more of who you already were. So it was a really humbling experience as a journalist to realize that my stories, I could write more and more stories about climate change, but if someone was in a polarized news environment, people tend to get dug in more when they face more information on an issue. This happened with the pandemic, the infodemic around the pandemic. This has happened with climate change for sure. And that says to me, better storytelling isn't always the solution, which is kind of why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
Wow. And we definitely want to hear all about the amazing work you're doing at the Earth Institute at Columbia. But let me just remind everyone, you're listening to watching a conversation with Andrew Revkin, the great environmental journalist. And we are talking about the news, and we're going to be reading the newspaper in just a minute with Andy. But Andy, I wanted to ask you about, when you saw the spread of the print newspapers on the screen, walk me through how you have experienced the changes when you were there at the Times. And are you surprised that we still have this array today in 2021?
It's been an amazing journey. I didn't come into this world to be a journalist. When I was born in Rhode Island, I grew up immersed in nature, especially the ocean. I was seduced by Jacques Cousteau, the famed 20th century oceanographer. He wasn't even an oceanographer. He was an explorer who took me underwater. My bar mitzvah present that I cherished was a diving mask from his company, U.S. Divers. And I got into journalism because it felt better to me to tell the story of science than to actually do the really hard work of spending 10 years just getting your chops, through a PhD and a postdoc, and then doing that one thing. As a journalist, you have the privilege of being able to look at the big picture if you have time. I came to the newsroom in 1995, April. Actually, this coming week would be my anniversary. Let's see how many years, quarter century ago, essentially. And it was a real adjustment. I had already been writing for magazines. I'd been, like in 1988, I wrote this cover. My first big story on global warming predates my time at the New York Times.
It says the greenhouse effect this summer was merely a warm up, and things have become so much worse since then. Oh my God.
So I'd already been writing for magazines, right? And magazines are interesting. You have this ability. You have fact checkers. You have here's another spread. You have time. There's an art to it. You can kind of like think about the lead and think about the nut graph and revise it and maybe have a kicker or the closing section of a story, and the newsroom was a very different experience. I was doing these totally minor stories, like a New York City's parks story. I remember, we'll get to that in a second. I was on deadline on a story about some New York City Parks Commission on the Hudson River Park, and Jack Cadden, a wonderful editor, who I don't know if he's been on your show before. He's retired now. He was leaning over my shoulder and he said, Revkin, this ain't no seed catalog. Meaning get it done. It's just a park story. And then it was like a hard transition to the speed factor. But I got used to it, and I was covering mainly the regional environment, which hadn't really been a full-time beat for anybody until then, and wrote about.
By the way, can I just interrupt for a second
Yeah.
to say you can hear in the background the sirens that happen to be going through sort of, that this past year, every day, dozens of times a day, we'd hear that sound. Someone called it the sad symphony of New York City. That sound has stopped. It's gone back to kind of the pre-pandemic sirens that we, of course, always associate with New York City. So in some ways, that tells you how much we have been able to control the virus, but there's still a long way to go. So just wanted to remind people, if you heard that sound, what's going on.
What was the first night people started banging their pans outside? It was right around now, I think.
Yeah, I presume so. Yeah, I presume April, May. Yeah, April, May, June, it was nonstop all day long.
Yeah, unbelievable.
So let's go back to your thoughts on.
Well, yeah, and that, I learned about the news business too. That my first week at the New York Times, April 14th, 1995, that's a period when you're supposed to, historically, a new reporter would have the luxury of, it was kind of like the Stations of the Cross. You get to hang out at the front page meeting for 3:30, 4:30 in the afternoon. You kind of got to explore the paper. And halfway through that week, the Oklahoma City bombing happened. And I remember Gene Roberts storming across the newsroom, heading in one direction, going, "Those bastards." No one knew what he was talking about yet, because this had just happened. And I was flung into that story. I didn't have time to jump on a plane and go to Oklahoma City. I was searching for the culprits, the accomplices, theorized accomplices to Timothy McVeigh, using phone books for Oklahoma City. We're doing hundreds of phone calls to try to find people who had been in the building that day and who could tell the survivor stories. And then, as I said, then I was trying to track down this John Doe character. So that taught me other things about the news business. My first really big story at the Times had nothing to do with climate or the environment. It was 1996, the destruction of TWA Flight 800 off of Long Island as it rose toward Paris. And I was coming into the city knowing I would be part of this story that morning. And I remember being on my cell phone, one of those early cell phones, and talking to Susan Edgerly, whose nickname was Edge. I don't know if she's been on your show before. She's a force of nature, and she was, already figuring out who was going to go where. And she mentioned that town in Montoursville, Pennsylvania, where a French class had, I think, 20 students died on that plane. And I was the one who had to drive to Montoursville, and I wrote this wrenching, I was there for 2 or 3 days reporting the story of the agony of Montoursville. And it was also a very devastating experience. There was a point when I left. I said, it's time for someone else to take on tracking this. And I drove like 80 miles an hour back to New York City saying, let me get into some other aspects of the story. And for the next 2 months, I was on Long Island with the FBI and NTSB trying to figure out what happened to that plane. And the answer was, we don't know.
And of course, I remember one of the first mass disinformation stories of kind of the internet age, because people were convinced the missile had brought it down, bomb, all of that. And it took so long to kind of unfold. It was also the first week of MSNBC being on the air and Fox News, and all of that was part of the story and how people track that. It's hard to imagine a time when there was no Fox News, but there certainly was after that.
And there's aspects, believe it or not, there's aspects of that story that I see have relationships to climate change. In fact, I have this term in my head these days. I call it the complexity monster. In journalism, we tend to look for the bad guy and the accountability part of a story. And sometimes it's complexity, or, the tens of thousands, if not more, flights of 747s on hot days have taken place without an overheated fuel tank exploding. But some conjunction of some flawed wire and some other trigger and the heat and the fact that the fuel tank was mostly empty led likely, as the NTSB finally said, we have a scenario we think has to be what happened, but there's no hard evidence. And climate change is complex. The basics are absolutely crystal clear. Greenhouse gases heat the planet. But but getting from there to what drove a wildfire in California is really complex, and we're always looking for the simple villain, and sometimes you have to write the complexity. And that's actually what led me from doing standalone stories to writing a blog, because I felt it was a way to capture some of that stuff too.
Well, the work you did on the .Earth blog was really pioneering and emulated by so many people. Can I just ask you about one climate change story that's been in the news? If we had you last Sunday, I'm sure we'd be talking about it. There's this, as people are trying to fight off the effect of the sun on the Earth, there was this attempt to block the sun's rays hitting the Earth, and they got right. It was just going to be an experiment, a small experiment by a Swedish team, and it got shut down. Can you talk about that, and what does that tell you about taking chances, doing innovative things? For those of us who read the story, some people may have been reminded of like science goes wrong, and then suddenly, if they had done that, and you end up, in a movie, you might end up with an ice age as a result of something like that.
Yeah, well, it's a classic case of, I guess, to encapsulate that. First of all, when scientists first identified global warming as a problem and reported to a president in 1965, Lyndon Johnson. I just happen to have this line here. I know you were going to ask about geoengineering. So let's see. This was 1965.
Report of the Environmental Pollution Panel, President's Science Advisory Committee.
Right. And down in here, you don't have to worry. It says CO2, carbon dioxide, is likely heating the planet. And our response could be to put particles in the atmosphere. Let's see, right?
Yeah, and it would cost, it says 100, produced by perhaps 100. Thus, 1% change in reflectivity might be brought about for $500 million a year.
Yeah, which is super cheap. So this is 1965, right? So this is not a new idea. And I did a session on my Sustain What webcast just a couple of weeks ago on the National Academies of Science, the big entity in the United States that independently assesses things, had concluded we absolutely need to be researching this, if only to understand why not to do it. But if you don't do the research, you really have no clarity on the possibilities, pro and con. And what happens is the standard narrative for climate change is that we have to cut CO2, the gas that's going into the atmosphere and heating the world. The problem with just relying on that strategy is it takes many decades for, even if we were on a track set under that Paris Agreement, your children will be old, they'll be, presuming you have children today who are, let's say, 10, when they're 60, when they're getting ready to think about retirement, you might see some incremental slowing of warming. That's how long that remedy takes.
Slowing, not even elimination. No, not even decrease.
So you have to go to zero. And this is Bill Gates's point. You have to go to zero. You have to take emissions to zero, or have some kind of accounting system that levels things. And that requires fundamentally more dramatic things than even the Paris Agreement is calling for. And many environmentalists are not really, their main complaint about geoengineering is they call it a moral hazard. If you pursue it, then it takes the pressure off of us to do the harder work of cutting carbon dioxide. The problem is you have to do both. We have to be grown-ups and think about multiple strategies and something as big and momentous and complex as global warming. And by the way, the volcanoes in 1991, the volcano in the Philippines, Pinatubo, demonstrated this effect. Volcanoes do this routinely. They cool the earth. They do it routinely. We don't say we have to stop the volcanoes from interfering with the atmosphere. They're a natural component of the Earth system. But when it's an unnatural component, we think of an intervention like this. We're thinking, oh my God, we're going to go to an ice age. It's just crap. It's not. it's an incremental thing that you have to actively do. So if it's going badly, you actively can sort of feather back. And the idea that we shouldn't do any research is simply silly.
You
Now,
saw Neil had shown the story about the canceled test.
Yeah, and by the way, on my webcast, we kind of, for those who are watching, we sort of broke the news that the Sami people in the Arctic, the indigenous community across Finland in that area, they were not consulted. So the people designing this research project made a big mistake, and they acknowledged it. Mike and their advisors acknowledged it on my show a couple of weeks ago. They said, we had some lawyers Swedish lawyers vetted Swedish law and said, yeah, you can fly a balloon there. But they didn't actually think about the bigger picture. Who should we actually be talking to? Who needs to be engaged in a discussion around this research before we initiate it? And by the way, I think Sami would have said no anyway, but they have to think about those contexts around the science too. Even if the contexts are difficult, you can't just make a mechanistic argument. Oh, the balloon it's not going to do anything. It's just the first step of seeing if the balloon works and our instruments work. We're not even releasing any stuff. That was irrelevant to the bigger question of what people think and feel and what activists are thinking about climate change. It's a really interesting story.
Yeah, here's Adam Glenn saying that Andrew is not just a great journalist, but one of the most searching thinkers on environmental topics in our journalistic ranks. We're lucky to have him, and Adam himself is a great environmental journalist. And we have seen governments trying different things. In Dubai, when I was there, they had sustained flooding and nonstop rain for 4 days because they had seeded the clouds. And that, so you're seeing governments do things. Macron says that in India, the Madurai-Vaigai River has been covered with thermocol sheets to save the river from evaporation.
Yeah, there's actually, in India and a couple other places, there are solar panels now on some canals, and the solar panels are staying cooler, operating more efficiently because of the water underneath, and they prevent the water from evaporating. There's some really cool innovations around the world.
And here's Amy is watching, and Amy is Neil's sister, watching very early in Bellevue, in Washington.
Wow.
So folks, everyone, please tag a friend. They can watch later or live as we talk to Andy Revkin. We're going to be looking at the paper and getting his thoughts on the paper in just a moment. Carla, who's one of our producers and longtime New York Times editor, says, I thought I read recently that CO2 has actually risen during the pandemic, even though there's been a lot less flying and driving. So can you talk about that? I know there's been less smog maybe, but more CO2. How is that possible?
Well, it's actually the temperatures rose. The global average temperature ticked upward, even though CO2 emissions dropped. And there's science that explains this, which is just as Sri just said, there are aerosols, little particulates that come out of smokestacks and diesel exhausts and the like that have a mix of properties themselves. Carbon dioxide is a gas. It's invisible to light. But these particles some of them reflect light, so they act like a shield, just like the geoengineered shield. And some of them absorb heat and warm the earth. Black carbon particles act sort of like a greenhouse gas. So what happened is when industry shut down, that mix of particles changed as well in a way that when you add it all up, and the climate system is a balanced system, you have to look at these different forcings, CO2, particles, any kind of solar variability. And when you add it all up, it meant that the earth still warmed a little bit, even though CO2 had dropped a little bit.
Thank you. Ernesto says multiple strategies that are not irreversible if they prove to be ineffective and counterproductive, is what Ernesto says. And Patricia says, so true, Andrew, balance is key. And Ernesto says, injecting aerosols does not sound reversible or predictable.
It's actually completely reversible. The aerosols only last for a few days. The ones that go way up high in the atmosphere can linger longer. But the whole idea of these experiments is you start with the first test was going to be a kilogram, 2.2 pounds of calcium carbonate, which is seashells. So it's not some intervention that's exotic or anything remotely calamitous leading us toward some path. The idea is that the policy path might become more difficult if people think, oh, there's an easy out and it's really cheap. They won't do the CO2 cuts. And that's an important real debate to have, but it doesn't mean you stop doing the science.
Can you, for a second, just talk about that hole in the ozone layer that we were also worried about in 89, 90? How did that get solved, and could that come back? And what are some lessons from that for science policy going forward?
Oh man, that was in here also in this story. 1987 was a critical year for the ozone layer. The science had been building for about a decade, showing that certain long-lived chemicals that we made that didn't exist in nature, that were synthetic compounds, could erode that sun-blocking veil for harmful radiation, not for temperature. And the world has done a remarkable turnaround on something. It was one of the first times, perhaps one of the only instances that comes to mind easily, where we saw a long-term threat, a building threat with indirect evidence, and acted assertively to mitigate it. And the way that agreement was structured in 1987, the Montreal Protocol, gave developing countries, which have much less capacity to think about or to invest in like a different kind of air conditioner using these compounds, they had a pass. They had about a 10-year delay. China as well. So that it had the architecture and it had results. We've reduced those emissions. There's some complexities going forward, but it's pretty clear we've dodged a bullet because of that. The problem is it's completely different than the carbon dioxide problem. And I'm really proud of this story in 1988 because in here there's a line that reflects that this is different. I talked to a Dutch environmental minister who said the thing about CFCs, the ozone depleting compounds, is you could get the manufacturers of all of these, every manufacturer of CFCs in the world, you could have their CEOs in one room, like 30 people. And industry was already working on alternatives. Carbon dioxide is generated by every activity, from cutting a forest in the Amazon to me talking to you on this computer, to cryptocurrency, to flying, to every modern aspect of life. And it's not like you can get all the CEOs in a room and say, we need to constrain these emissions. And you certainly can't do it when there aren't alternatives they're coming, of course. Solar and storage is becoming a bigger part of grids, but still the world right now, 30 plus years after I wrote this 1988 article, we're still 83% carbon generated energy around the world. When you look at primary energy, which is all the energy we use, factories and homes and buildings and the like. So this is a long journey, and it's so it's not like CFCs. It's not like the Montreal Protocol or Ozone. It's tougher.
Thank you. I see my friend Kevin Noblet is watching. A terrific international journalist, was at the AP and other places for a long time, and he says watching and learning. Kevin, we'd love to have you on the show in the future Sunday. Please get in touch or let us know if you would be open to that. And before we just go back to the paper, tell us about your webcast and how people can learn about all the great work that you're doing, Andy.
Well, it was a little over a year ago, March 12th, as lockdown was locking down. I scrambled to think about what I could do to foster some rational thinking and action on critical questions around the pandemic and still around these other issues. And I thought back to the model I had created with .earth, my Times blog, which started in 2007. Not because an editor said, hey, Andy, we need an environmental blog. It's because I felt the conversations around climate required a more immersive, sustained conversational approach, meaning a dialogue with readers, not just writing stories. And I stumbled on StreamYard, partially because of you, Sri, because you were already using it. I can't remember when did you start using StreamYard?
In December we started doing that.
Yeah, so you're ahead of the curve as always. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I can do one thing and have it go to 3 or 4 places, which I like a lot. And I just started doing it. My first conversation was with a young scientist who's created a fantastic initiative called Skype a Scientist. It started with a hashtag, and it was a way to link classrooms anywhere in the world, teachers and students with scientists doing really interesting work. So I had her on because I thought, all right, we're all going to be locked down on screens. You've been doing this for several years. So what are some lessons? I just did a new one with her just to revisit with her. And then within weeks, it developed this rhythm. Sundays, as today, after our show here, is music. As you can see there, the great Gwen Laster, a jazz and improvisational violinist. Poets come on. Andrei Codrescu has been on dozens of times. Musicians. So that's Sundays. Mondays is what I call Thriving Online. And that's, I've had you on to talk about Twitter. And Wednesdays and Fridays, not every week, are on the tougher issues that we face around the pandemic and climate change and the like. So it became a way for me to build some conversations that around critical issues, sometimes on the news. I'm doing one this Wednesday on the eruption in the Caribbean on the island of St. Vincent, which is going to get worse before it gets better. And some disaster experts are going to be on Wednesday. I haven't even set that one up yet. So sometimes they're off the news, and sometimes they're on these big, tough, just basic questions like how do you make Twitter work better?
And let's make sure everybody knows that at 10:30 today you can catch the Sunday edition, which is so much fun with music, storytelling, and just great stuff. So look for the Sustain What webcast. We have a quick question. Well, it's not a quick question, but an important one. Amy, who's watching from Washington State, says, I'm homeschooling my 5-year-old son. He's fascinated by weather, natural disasters, generally very curious. In preparation for Earth Day, I just read him a wonderful book called Heroes of the Environment. In your opinion, what are the 3 most important environmental issues I should be teaching him or making him aware of?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I love that the context of disaster risk, because if there's one thing I learned on my beat, it's that I thought I was covering the environment. I thought I was covering climate. I thought I was covering earthquakes, which I did tons of, the tsunami in the Indian Ocean. I'm really covering risk. My beat for 34 years has been risk. And risk is a combination of things. It's the hazard, which can be a volcano, like in St. Vincent, climate change around the planet, impacts on biodiversity in the Amazon, my book on the rainforest. But risk is always delineated by how many people are in the way or how many things you care about and what is their vulnerability. So if climate was changing and we all lived in Singapore in that one of those bubble gardens covered with glass and had air conditioning and money, climate could change forever and we wouldn't even notice hardly. We don't, because we are more vulnerable than that. Our food has to be grown. So when you start to think about the world in the context of risk, it really illuminates a huge number of things, including what you can do locally to reduce risk from flooding, fire, storms, whatever the hazard is in your region. And especially for young people, that's an action that leads to all the action points. One action point is, voting differently and trying to get Congress to do something different. That's going to take a long time, and we can all wave our signs, our climate crisis signs. But the climate solutions are delineated by looking at risk and also including who's most vulnerable. Well, guess what? It's mostly people of color or people who are poor. And so risk illuminates what we call now, there's this phrase that's really hot now, climate justice. It's who's at risk. And then you start there and you say why they're at risk. What can you do about it? And it makes what looks like this momentously large, paralytically complex issue into a series of action points. And I think that's I'm just not going to say 3. I'm going to say 1. Look at the world through a lens of risk and opportunity, and you can spend your life doing things productive and interesting.
Thank you. And folks, please follow Andy on Twitter. He's at Revkin. And let's take a look at the news and the newspapers all arrayed here in front of me. We had already looked at the front page, but just wanted to see if you had any thoughts about any of these stories and how they're being covered in the Times these days.
Yeah, the one you mentioned about migration, well, the issue, immigration and migration, are one of these systemic challenges. We are focused on the border, and then if you're not asking why are kids at the border, why is it particularly kids, how did they get there, what's driving them to be leaving their homes, then you can start to see, well, it's everything from economic and political oppression to climate stress is in the mix. Not just climate change, but climate stress. Many areas around the world that are poor are also vulnerable, deeply vulnerable to drought and flood and storms. Honduras got hit by 2 maximum intensity hurricanes this past year. And so that means that a part of what you're looking at is a climate story, not just a climate change story. And it's complex. There's no simple line to draw between carbon dioxide rising in the atmosphere and kids at the border. But if we're not thinking systemically about these issues, we'll always end up writing too much about the bleeding wound and not about what led to that issue. And it's a challenge that transcends environmental coverage. It transcends this issue. The drug trade is, a classic case too, which is very linked to this as well. How do you solve the drug problem? There's no simple answer. And so how do you fit that into a beat or into a story? I got pretty frustrated with the news construct. The requirements to get, I used to talk, there's a hashtag I began using, the front page thought. You have to be aware of the front page thought, because sometimes it leads to an overly simplistic focus of our conversation in society around how to fix a problem.
Thank you. We are just looking through the paper here. Here's a headline from history. On this day in 1970, 51 years ago, Paul McCartney announced the previous day that he had broken away from his bandmates over a series of differences, all but sealing the end of the iconic group, the Beatles. And of course, the world changed after that.
Yeah, music matters to me hugely. I don't just run that show because I like music. I play music.
Yes, and I see your instrument behind you.
Yeah, for later. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was very lucky to play for 20 years with Pete Seeger, who was a neighbor up here in the Hudson Valley. And
I know that's an awesome story of that you got to know him, and he was, of course, someone who cared a lot about the environment.
He was a source of mine too. One of my first big series was on the restoration and revival of the Hudson River, which significantly was driven by some of the activism he pursued through the boat, the Clearwater, and it was neat to get to know him as an individual after that too, and as a friend.
You can't trust anyone. Russia's hidden COVID toll is an open secret. This is the time when he had died in 2014.
Yeah, I visited him in the hospital the day within 24 hours of his passing. There were a bunch of us there, and Judy Collins showed up, and there was singing, and it was unforgettable.
It must have been very moving. So this story, if I can come back here to Russia's hidden COVID toll, what you've seen, how governments have behaved, does that also worry you for climate data and climate change stories? When things happen in remote portions of the world, and will the government share information about rising water and in the Arctic, Antarctic, things like that?
Well, I for both climate and COVID, and when I was doing a ton of my webcasts on COVID-19 issues, including information gaps. Laurie Garrett, who's a superstar on this beat since the 90s, was on several times. I think the encouraging factor here is to think about the role of, this gets to Stuart Brand way back, said information wants to be free. And I don't mean money. Information wants to get out. And what we saw, I think it was January 22nd or so, there was a tweet from someone working with a Chinese colleague that led at that moment in January, way back, to the almost instantaneous efforts to get vaccines in the works. There was the genome was released too, not too long after. And so information, we live in a world now where it's harder for countries to keep things bottled up. China has much to answer for in terms of how it constrained information around what was happening there. But ultimately, it was that freedom of information, literally that colleague to colleague, that got this data out, that led to having the capacity for us to be significantly vaccinated in the United States here just 1 year later. Climate, the same thing. We live in a world of increasingly imposable transparency. There are groups now that monitor satellite imagery that shows which power plants burn. You can look at coal-fired power plants from space, and you can see which ones are operating and which ones are not operating. You can see the piles of coal coming and going, like big pile of coal, small pile of coal. And so we're developing with an open information system, as long as we have an open internet and access to things like satellite imagery, it's increasingly possible to prompt countries to be more honest about their own data. This has come out already, including ahead of the Paris Agreement in 2015. China released more accurate figures about its use of coal and its emissions. And the thinking was that happened because they knew they can't hide anymore. So that's encouraging to me, both for COVID and for climate, that the world's becoming more transparent. There are all kinds of issues around that too, related to privacy, but the upside of it is pretty profound.
Thank you. Let's keep going in the international section. There's an unusual story about a small Polish town of 32,000 people that voted to be free of LGBT. And what was dismissed as a right-wing stunt has become a costly embarrassment for Krasnik and its residents. And this gentleman, who described himself as Krasnik's only open gay, moved to the nearby city of Lublin, where he said people were more open-minded. Norway and France and other places have severed ties with this town. And Poland is a place where we're seeing more far-right movement and popularity.
That's so interesting. I guess there too, I get the sense that information flows are revealing these issues. Would Norway and other countries be pressuring Poland if these kinds of stories didn't come out as quickly as they do now? I think 30 or 40 years ago, it would have taken a lot longer for the world generally to become aware of some of these issues. It used to be that a New York Times correspondent would have to go there and figure it out. I guarantee you that this arose through local social media or local press coverage that then gets amplified and ends up in the Times and other global media, and that can influence things, hopefully, in certain situations.
Sliding in the polls, Erdogan kicks up a new storm over the Bosphorus, and this is about carving out a new shipping route. And of course, we saw that big story about the Suez Canal this past month and all the problems. It also showed how everything is tied together and how small the world really is.
Choke points. I did a ton of pieces on Arctic shipping. The Arctic, as it opens, it gets warmer. There's more open water in summers. And Russia is routinely now sending some shipping across Russia from Asia, across the top. And when the Suez Canal got blocked, I was tweeting about this really boosts Russia's argument for Arctic shipping. So even as we bemoan global warming, it's leading to routes that, by the way, are a huge shortcut. Many thousands of miles of fuel burning are avoided by going through the Arctic. Lots of issues there, but
of course, and damaging the Arctic along the way.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Prince Philip. This is a second-day story, not the obit, which we'll look at in just a second. This is about how Prince Harry is going to go to the funeral. Meghan Markle's not going because she's pregnant and has been advised not to go. So this is a fascinating story, the coverage of it. Neil has the obit. Of course, obits are often pre-written, and someone like him was pre-written, but our friend Wayne Kamadoy, who is a designer at the Times, tells us that this was a pre-designed obit as well. So they had set it up and had it ready, and you can see his life, including as a little Greek boy. He was Greek origin, and you can see him in that little photo on the left is of him dressed in traditional Greek clothing.
Obits are a very special part of the Times. I'm sure you've had some of the great obit writers on there.
Sure. And we've had the obit editors there as well, and people who written obits, and so that's been fascinating. And we'll look at the obits together in just a minute. Satanic mania lit a powder keg of American anxieties. Baseless conspiracy theories about cults and child abuse were a backdrop to cultural change. And I remember, speaking of music, everyone was convinced that rock musicians were embedding satanic messages in their records. I was trying to explain this to my kids the other day, how that you should listen to records backwards. You can't listen to a Spotify track backwards. You can't.
I will say that one reason that I bought Abbey Road when that was 1970 something, as a kid, was the rumors that Paul had died. That was the I Buried Paul. It was in there somewhere looped in.
Yeah.
Admit it freely.
This was an online feature that they're now showing the results in, or talking about this in print. What they did was the Times showed different precincts, a photo of a different precinct that you could, in 360 photo, so you could kind of move around in Street View, and said, could you tell who they voted for? And more than 1 million people voted online. I don't know if you tried this or you saw this, but it was fascinating and very difficult to tell.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So you were supposed to tell by looking. Let's quiz you here. Let's pick one of these. I don't know how you're supposed to tell, but can you tell if they voted for Biden? At number 4 here, did they vote for Biden or Trump?
I would guess Trump.
Yeah, we should also know where this was. Yeah, so this was +1 for Trump. You were right, in Los Lunas, New Mexico.
Yeah, oh, that's so funny.
And then
now,
here
that's a story that definitely works better online because you can actually do the immediate clicking.
Sure. And here's the results. They talked about how they did this and how people did it. To me, it felt very difficult to tell. So I wasn't, there was some luck involved in that as well. DeSantis is a major successor to Trump, and he is someone who has done a lot of damage to thinking about kind of facts and science along the way. The governor of Florida. How about this story? A teacher went to the Capitol insurrection, and Christine Hostetter is her name. Jump in on anything that catches your eye here. Trump's World Bank pick embraces climate fight.
There we go.
So that's interesting. David Malpass was met with skepticism when he was selected in 2019 for a 5-year term as World Bank president, but he seems to be, I guess that's what the headline says. I can't tell. Does embrace climate fight mean a good thing? I think that's what it means.
Well, yeah, although the World Bank has a tough road to go there because developing countries, many like India, still require so much more electricity. And it's even with India's enormous investments in solar, Modi has been very credited for that. They need to use more coal before they use less. And so if you're the World Bank, they're being pressured from the left by, and John Kerry has been part of this, by just to really clamp down on new coal power. But if you're facing India or some other countries where electrification, and Africa is the next frontier there, is an imperative, it gets complicated. You can actually create more resentment by taking a harder line on climate. So we'll see how that plays out.
By the way, such an unusual ad and an expensive full-page ad in the New York Times for a film called Call It COVID. And they're saying, I guess, don't call it the China flu, things like that. And call it COVID-19.
Well, I wish them luck.
Well, by the way, we've debated this with Trish Hall, who was opinion editor at the New York Times, deputy. She was one of the opinion editors at the Times. I asked her when she was on our show about the use of the word climate change versus global warming. If it had been called climate change in the 70s, would that have made a difference in people?
I've spoken about this many times. It's the right has this conspiracy theory that the terms changed from global warming to climate change because the world wasn't warming as hot as people thought, and it's all idiotic, because when the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the original treaty on climate change, 1992, was climate change. That's 1992. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the panel that helps the world understand climate science, was created in 1988. It's not the Intergovernmental Panel on Global Warming or the Intergovernmental Panel on the Climate Crisis. It's climate change. So that term has been around forever, and the idea that there was some kind of switcheroo or the like is silly. And frankly, I think you can call it whatever you want, and we're not going to. This is not an issue that's subject to terminology. In other words, our needs for energy and our path-dependent norms are not just going to change because someone changes the name. The Guardian newspaper, I disagree with them. They changed their style book. They said reporters basically have to call it the climate crisis or climate breakdown now. And to me, that reminds me of the movie Spinal Tap, for those who've seen it, the MuckRack documentary, where the rock star has his amplifier customized so that it goes to 11 instead of 10. You know, turning it up to 11 doesn't actually change anything. So I'm not I don't think that matters much.
Okay, folks, we have about half an hour, a little less than that, left with the great Andy Revkin. We're talking about the newspapers, his work as an environmental journalist. And here we're looking at the obits. Are there obits that you contributed to write, that you wrote that you're especially memorable?
I put a link in the chat, into our private chat, of the one I think was my favorite obit that I wrote. I wrote probably 8 or 10, but it's of a fellow who died at the age of 100, Victor Mills. He was the father of disposable diapers, among other things. He was a remarkable character. He had dozens of inventions, but it was Procter and Gamble he worked at, and writing that was interesting. Victor Mills, who led an engineering team that invented the first mass market disposable diaper and changed the way millions of parents attend to infants, died on Saturday. He was 100 years old, etc.
This is an example, I think, of a topic where if they had to be invented today, people would object to diapers because what they'll do to the environment,
Right.
things like that.
Right.
And so, but of course, it changed the life of parents and others who had to deal with.
Well, it gets, convenience matters, and these bigger issues sometimes get, not sometimes, they often get in the background when we think about changing diapers. I remember my first son, we tried cloth diapers, and it was a lot of work because of the environment. We were very focused on those issues, but boy, was it a lot of work.
And you said that you named 3 things that had such big impact for convenience: Bic pens, and microwave ovens, and disposable diapers.
Yeah, there you go.
The obits in today's paper: Martina Batan, New York art dealer, consumed by a cold case, dies at 62. Finding answers to the unsolved murder of her brother becomes a lifelong quest. Ethel Gabriel, 99, a rare woman in the record world, and with her fellow producers Don Wardell and Alan Dell at the 1983 Grammys. They shared the Best Historical Album Award for Tommy Dorsey Frank Sinatra Sessions, a producer at MCA overseeing Living Strings and Other Profitable Lines. Oh, I didn't realize Ramsey Clark had died. He was so much in the news over many decades. Attorney General and rebel with a cause, is dead at 93. He was a civil rights leader and radical lawyer. And I just wanted to just tell folks that, if you know someone who has passed away, there's a new social app that you can use to pay tribute to them. Check out Miss You Gram. It's available on iPhone, MISS-U-Gram. Do check it out. And of course, there's the paid obits also in the New York Times. Sports section. Are you a sports fan?
Red Sox growing up, because I grew up in Rhode Island, and got to go to some games very early on. Saw Carl Yastrzemski, and it was really fun. But not
how frustrating is it for a Boston fan to have grown up in the drought era, and then Boston became kind of championship city, not just in baseball, but of course football as well. It was always good in basketball when you were growing up. But
yeah, the Celtics.
what is that like to have such a big, drastic change in the 2010s and 2000s?
It's funny now in this era, I watch, especially because we now have a media environment that allows you to watch at least highlights from virtually every game. I just love baseball for its special moments, for the epic battles between pitchers and hitters. And I'm not really attuned to a specific team anymore. Partially, I think, and even with soccer and everything now, the world of information and access has become global for those who are online. And you can watch my son, like my 23-year-old son, his favorite sport is soccer, and he's watching live games that never would have been part of his TV experience or
Sure.
from Europe and elsewhere in the world. I think it helps to knit us in ways that get us away from geographic affiliation.
Sure. We won't have time to go through all the sections, but why don't you pick the next one you want to go to?
Oh, maybe books.
All right. So let's look at this. This is about Philip Roth, and he wanted to have like an authorized biography written about himself, and he had fits and starts with different people, and finally this book has come out. What are you reading these days?
You just got a book I can't wait to read by my old friend Peter Raven, who's one of the great botanists of all time, and I'll just show you here.
It's called I can't quite see it. You lift it up a little higher.
Sorry. It's Driven by Nature. It's his autobiography, essentially.
Oh, nice.
And he's just a pivotal figure. He's one of the foundational people at Modern National Geographic Society. So I can't wait to read it. It's on my to-do list. I tend to read books that are on my beat. Other books that are around me are not always new. I was saying earlier, The Idea Factory, which is about Bell Labs.
I've read that. That's a good book.
And it's something that we forget, actually. Industry, back in the day, AT&T, Bell Labs had a huge research project initiative, and industry doesn't really do basic R&D. Actually, Elon Musk does, but industry at large has shrunk how much money it puts into basic inquiry, and the country. We're seeing a change now with Biden. There is a new burst of money in the budget for basic science that I think is crucial to navigating these next few decades as we peak out at 9 or so billion people mid-century. If we're not investing a lot more in basic science, and particularly in the social sciences, how we work, how we think, how we act, and how we fail to act, we're going to have more trouble through these decades than we would have without that. So innovation is something I read a lot about.
Here's Nikhil Hatti Singh says, really enjoyed listening to Andrew Revkin. Thanks. Great to have you here, Nikhil. And he says, my son was born very conscious of the environment and has been telling us off since he started speaking about things like using paper towels and buying water in plastic bottles. The result is that we've changed our ways, and he's now hoping to launch a career in environmental policy when he graduates this May. It's awesome. Congrats to him. And that's important. I think our contribution in our home has been to get rid of paper towels. The entire pandemic, we stopped using them, and it felt like a small step, but worthy step. We're just flipping through the book review here, folks. Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight. This is a fascinating story about how she had her secret diaries that talked about how much influence she had on Lyndon Johnson, who's been written about a lot, by people like Robert Caro and others. And this was not well known, or not at least by the public. And now
do you remember her Plant a Tree? She was also a huge proponent of reforestation and planting trees, which is now a rising. This is the decade of land restoration, the UN calls it, and the more we could do to tend to landscapes, the better. But I remember she was kind of disparaged or made fun of a little bit for that.
And by the way, I mean, can we have, the world, can it be saved when the leader of Brazil, which obviously controls the Amazon, is, not in favor of any of the good policy choices? Like it seems like anytime he has a policy choice, he makes the wrong one.
We had a couple of sessions on my webcast related to the pandemic impacts in Brazil, let alone the forest impacts, both. And he's an extraordinarily destructive leader. It's just been astounding to watch. And that's again, like with Trump, that's where rhetoric really matters. It wasn't even necessarily changing policies, but when his rhetoric on taking away the indigenous rights to the mining resources underneath their reserves, for example, a lot of informal miners, that saw that as a not a get out of jail free card, but as a never go to jail card. And so the mining pressure and invasions of Indian reserves in the Amazon intensified just through his rhetoric. Same thing with COVID,
Sure.
it's nothing, people, leadership matters, and the lack of it matters.
Their health system is on the verge of collapse, if not actual collapse. Yeah. I want to just connect two different sections here. There's a story about millennials mixing populist anger with political savvy, and there's the book called The AOC Generation, how millennials are seizing power and rewriting the rules of American politics. But many people have pointed out that this story about the New York City's mayoral race, it isn't as if the most progressive people are leading the race right now. And so here is wait, could Andrew Yang really be New York City's next mayor?
I'm really interested to see how that plays out. I was impressed with a number of points he made during the campaign around technology for obvious reasons, and he's such an interesting character.
Black and Wary, I got vaccinated anyway, and this is a story about vaccine hesitation.
We did, on my webcast, the first vaccine hesitancy the conversation I did was it was almost a year ago. It was, maybe it was in May. And there's so much that's understood about the social science here. It's really a tough issue, because if you badger people, as I said earlier, you make them more resistant. And in the social media environment we're in now, where everyone's kind of insulated and reinforced by what they see, it's really hard to figure out how to overcome that. And, it's important. I think right now, isn't the figure it's like 20% of New Yorkers are vaccinated now? It's something like that. I'm talking about the whole state. We have a long way to go here. And if there are these gaps in the landscape of vaccination, it's going to keep things percolating.
Sure. Just want to point out that Nick Kristof has written about tree huggers and loggers and finding a common interest. I don't know if you've read this particular piece yet.
Is it from the U.S. Northwest?
Yeah, it's in Oregon.
His home turf.
That's right.
A long time ago, Paul Hawken, who's a profoundly important environmentalist, told me about during the spotted owl fights, where there were owls being nailed to trees, and he said there were common elements, and you could find them if you looked, and if you worked carefully to build a conversation, you could find common ground.
And this is, sometimes I feel like with the magazine, you could do a whole episode just on the magazine because there's so much to cover. But this particular topic, what does America owe immigrants from countries that have been destabilized by U.S. foreign policy? And you can think that list of countries, goes back a long way to Iran in 1953 and much, much more. So,
yes.
Look at this. I've not heard of this, but pre-college, zoomed out after a year of isolation, get your kids back into the real world, into the world. Let's see here. What else is in the magazine?
That zoomed out story gets back to what I said about Skype a Scientist. There are ways to engage students even after the pandemic on what we can do via the screen. We've kind of developed this hate relationship with this thing, but the upside is you're connecting globally. Like, there was this amazing project I did a session on last year, where Amazon deforestation and invasions of Indian reserves by miners was identified using satellite images by students in Iowa and Massachusetts through an interface. These people who do a project called Earthrise.education, Earthrise.education spelled out. And that showed me the power of engaging kids, sometimes through the screen, with data and information that can make the world a better place. And their work ended up generating a Reuters article that actually put pressure on Brazil to get serious about slowing the mining invasion. So I thought it's not all about getting back into, and I love my wife and I, we love engaging with kids outside. That's a lot of her work end. But we shouldn't say, okay, we're done with screens. There's so much good that can be done with a kind of a hybrid approach.
Sure. Speaking of screens, Susanna's asking, what do you think of vaccine selfies?
I wasn't allowed to take one at Javits. The Javits, you can't have your camera. So I think it's okay for people to demonstrate what they've done. This issue of vaccine passports gets complicated because of my libertarian friends, including my libertarian relations, see that they don't want the government to have some way to exclude or include you based on your vaccination status. That's a tough issue, but I think it's fine for people to spread the joy. And I know everyone I know who got vaccinated, certainly the first shot particularly, had this upswelling of emotion when that happened. I
Sure.
certainly did.
Sure.
It's just a powerful feeling of doing your part, not just for yourself, but for humanity.
Linda says, I have several well-educated friends who are resisting the vaccine. A shame. And MuckRack is asking about the Leaders Climate Summit, 40 plus nations, first time coming to Biden-Harris White House.
Oh, well, why 40 is my first question. Already,
you mean instead of 200? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I've seen lots of, if you look online, there are a lot of developing country folks who've been very angry about this. Why is this some exclusive party? And actually, if it's cast correctly, this is both George W. Bush and Obama had what they called major economies approach to the climate problem. Who's actually doing the 85% of the emissions? It's like 8 countries. So getting them in a room for sure on emissions is what you want to do. And then who's vulnerable? It's mostly poor countries. So getting them in a room makes a lot of sense on the climate risk reduction. Again, which, as I said at the beginning of the show, is really detached from emissions reduction. Emissions reduction doesn't reduce risk on the ground for many decades. So what are you doing on the ground in the meantime? That's something where USAID and lots of other initiatives we have can build relationships with vulnerable countries that can generate more enthusiasm around the whole climate problem. But sort of saying we're going to have a leader summit, 40 people, and it's good, but I worry. And the same thing, by the way, in Glasgow in November is the next climate meeting, and UK and others are desperate for there to be an actual in-person meeting. And it's just I can't imagine that happening safely in a world with such glaring gaps in vaccination. Basically, I think it's still about 6 billion people out of the 7.8 billion people in the world have not had a first shot yet.
Yeah.
So how do you get 196 countries together, including 20,000 usual hangers-on lobbyists, environmentalists? Greta Thunberg yesterday, the young activist, said she doesn't plan on going unless there's a true global commitment to full vaccination.
Thank you. Lippy Roy, a former guest on this show multiple times, says vaccine passport is a misleading term. Vaccine verification, perhaps better. We have driver's licenses and other forms of identification. I think businesses will ultimately drive up vaccination rates. And many of you know she's doing terrific analysis explaining this on various platforms.
I should get her on my show.
She's awesome. So you absolutely should. Yeah, she's terrific. We're running out of time, and we have some of your articles we wanted to show and take you down memory lane. So let's do that. We have multiple articles that we can show from Andy's collection here. So we'll just let you walk us through them.
Yeah, I had written my book, The Burning Season, about the murder in the Amazon back in 1990. I was not working full time anywhere. I was writing a book on global warming at that time. And the oil wells were on fire in Kuwait after Saddam Hussein invaded. And I just was sitting there in Brooklyn typing. And actually, no, I was already up the river at that point. And I thought, what if all the oil just burned up? And what would that do to the geopolitical dynamics around the Middle East? And wrote that piece. And it got published. I was kind of blown away. It was my first byline. It was 4 years before I joined the paper staff. And what was notable to me afterwards, I don't know if you have that image nearby, was that when you look at that printed page, right next to it was one of those ExxonMobil ads saying what a good company they are. So it's like, this is a complicated landscape. And there's a whole story behind how Mobil, through some PR folks, geniuses, was able to buy space on the op-ed page and create its own part of the conversation. And .earth, I launched .earth in a very busy time, the mid-2000s, the mid-aughts, or whatever they call them, because the story felt like front page coverage. The stories I was writing, conventional beginning, middle, end stories, were missing the bigger picture. And it was not just about climate. My daily question was, how do we head toward 9 billion people with the fewest regrets? And so this, as you see there in 2009, I wrote about the avian flu and the idea that one world, one health, and I was hardly alone, that I was tagging on to Laurie Garrett, Donald McNeil, who said such a controversial moment recently, one of the great health writers, contagion writers, and they were writing about these kinds of risks at that time. And then I innovated. I tried to figure out, comments are so brittle and people are yelling at each other in words. So one day I had this idea of maybe my comment community could post little YouTube videos, just little messages to each other. And this woman, Wang Suya, who's still in Tokyo, she's Chinese by birth, but living in Tokyo and working there, she posted the first .earth Meet the Neighbors video. And she basically just said, "Hi, I'm Wang Suya. I'm here in Tokyo. I'd like to comment on .earth. I hope you'll keep commenting on .earth." And I just loved that. And it didn't catch on in a big way because the technology we just didn't have the capacity at the paper beyond. It was a one shot. I did the whole thing on my own pretty much. But I love that idea of engaging with readers. Oh yeah, and then in 2003, when I went to the North Pole, this was a transformational moment for me. The North Pole trip, not just because of it was an amazing, rare place to visit, but Rebecca de Moulin, who was a web editor back in 2003, still early days of the web, said, let's do a reader Q&A. So we did an Ask Me Anything. I'm not sure Reddit had already been born at that time. And I was taking reader questions live on the sea ice at the North Pole, drifting 2 miles a day over the Arctic Ocean, 2 mile deep ocean. As you can see there, I'm in a tent with some Russian tourists whose camp we were sort of utilizing as a hub. And that interactivity with readers is what led to .earth, along with other things. Amazing time. You're muted, Sri.
Yeah,
Sri, there we go.
Yeah, thanks. And Neil, I know we have a video clip that we
do. We do. I was going to pull that up.
Yeah.
And this is from your time on the North Pole.
Yeah,
right,
and just to set it up, I went to the North Pole. I was going to be there for 3 days. There was one other reporter, Alexander Witzy, who's still a friend, and I figured if I'm going to go to the North Pole for the New York Times, I better come back with every possible form of story. So I brought a camcorder that the nascent New York Times video unit gave to me, and you had to keep the batteries warm by sticking them in my turtleneck collar so they didn't freeze. And I shot as much video as I could. I handed the camera here to someone else, and you can see what the scene is.
First time in the history of the New York Times has attained the North Pole, or we've reached it. It's a remarkably red and white pole.
And we flew, this is a 500-mile flight to get to the North Pole from northernmost part of Canada, landing on the sea ice. So we're landing on ice that's 2.5 miles, on water 2.5 miles deep, which is an unnerving experience, although, the ice at that time was thick enough. And the scientists are just incredibly dogged. You think of scientists as being this privileged community, but they work their asses off. I wrote the main feature I did for the New York Times, talked about how there were 3 broken bolts in a particular piece of gear, and if they didn't fix them, this multi-million-dollar project was doomed. And so these multi-PhD geniuses are down on their hands and knees, and it was 20 degrees below zero. Ooh. And there's the Russian helicopter. And there are Russian zillionaires there, oligarchs, on the same 30 miles from where we were, they were ski-doing, and they actually had an AK-47. I didn't get any shots of them shooting their AK-47 off. And there was a paragliding Belgian. This guy had paraglided across Antarctica. He was paragliding at the North Pole. So it was a really surreal experience. And, you know, you can't do this now. The ice, this is April. This is exactly this time of year in 2003. The ice is much thinner. This is multiple year ice. Oh yeah, here's the Russian camp worker. And the woman, she ended up in my page one story in the Times. Natasha Lieberman, she was the runner-up in a Moscow beauty contest for like older women. And the winner didn't want the prize, which was going to the North Pole. So she said, I'll go. And the food was not very good.
What is that?
Mashed potatoes-ish.
Would you be comfortable landing in that same spot today?
No, you couldn't. There's the camp. That's the research camp, the scientist camp. And we're
So
landing there.
in just since 2003, this place that had 2 miles of ice under it.
Oh no, but it's 2 miles of water. The ice is about 8 feet thick at this point. But
Right.
8 foot thick ice doesn't. There's a tiny bit of that left in the Arctic. It's most of the ice there. Oh, here, this was unnerving. That water is 14,000 feet deep, and here's a Russian camp worker going, oh, this tapping with a 2x4, and the ice is moving and shifting and making noises. You'll hear some amazing noises here. This is the ice you hear.
Ice just moving on its own.
Yeah, it's kind of crashing into each other.
So if you fell or you drop something, it goes.
You can feel this.
So listen to that.
tank that we're on actually starting to fail a bit more. Probably hairline cracks up the towards the helos there.
So does that mean we should back up?
Yeah, you always jump over a crack.
That was one of the best answers to a question I've ever had as a reporter. And listen to that noise. It's like the noise when you're taking the lid off of a styrofoam container. You know, the squeaky, but on the scale of multi-mile sheets of ice floating on the sea, punching into each other. It was extraordinary.
Wow. Well, we know we need to get you ready for your show at 10:30. Everyone, please tune in and watch Andy's show every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Jonathan Borstein says, great guest, great show. Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan,
Thanks,
for always
Jonathan.
watching. Ron Thomas is watching from Dubai. And just great to have everybody here. Andy, we wish you the very best. Everyone, please follow him on Twitter at Revkin and check out the webcast that you can find on the Earth Institute's website. Any final thoughts before you go?
Just that the world's complex. Anyone who says that something's coming to an end in 10 years or that we fix a problem is missing that scope. And so sustained engagement on questions and solutions is required. This is not the work of one story. It's the work of an arc of stories, an arc of inquiry, and stay engaged and get engaged. Stay engaged on social media. Don't leave it to the jerks because they'd be happy to take over the space.
And look, we've booked you a guest for your show. Dr. Lippy Roy says she'd be honored to be on your show. So
We'll work that out.
And as a reminder, and we'll just clear that comment as a reminder, Andy's show starts at 10:30. He actually scheduled his show so that it's clear of Sri's Sunday
That's
New York
right.
Times.
Thank you.
That's right. I did
Thank
indeed.
you.
Thank you, Andrew. So it's the guest Gwen Laster is on today's show. Again, you can find it on Revkin at Revkin on Twitter. You will find the link.
And anywhere video streams.
Thanks
you.
again.
Thanks for
for
having
joining
me
us.
on. Yeah, and have a good day, all of you, and stay
Thank
safe.
you. And good luck, Andy. I can't wait to see you in person.
Yep, we'll do that.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Neil. Great show today. We learned so much. I loved the opportunity to spend time with Andy, who understands communication and the importance of how you tell science stories to the public in such good ways. So we have some other shows coming up, so let's talk about that.
Absolutely. So at 11 o'clock on Sundays, we have She's on Call, where Sri takes my role as executive producer with our hosts, Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar and Dr. Marina Kurian. Sri, can you tell us about this week's show?
Yeah, they're my co-executive producers and two fantastic surgeons. And today the topic is all things obesity, psychological, the psychology of obesity and treatments. And they have two very important folks who will be joining them to talk about various aspects of obesity. So look for She's on Call on any platform, and tell your friends about this. They also talk a little bit about COVID. And the show is rebroadcast on WBAI on Mondays from 2 to 3. So definitely tune in.
And then in addition to She's on Call, later in the week, our friend Stefan Kaplan has the Spin It Social Hour, Thursday, April 15th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Pacific. It's where photographers share their work and journeys. His guest this week is Roxanne Overton. You can find her on Instagram, Roxanne_Overton_photography. So please watch the Spin It Social Hour, and we can hit the Spin It Social Hour is on Twitter at Spin It Social, Facebook.com Spin It Social, on YouTube and on LinkedIn. The hashtag is Spin It Social Hour. And then, of course, next week, Sri, our guest on the New York Times Read Along is the author Robert Strauss. He's the author of The Final Founder, a somewhat unconventional biography of U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall. He's also the author of a book, The Worst President Ever. But the kicker is that it's not that worst president ever. It's actually about James Buchanan, and he will explain to us why he thinks James Buchanan. His book actually came out in 2016, and I definitely want to hear his thoughts on whether James Buchanan is still the worst president ever 4 years after Donald Trump. He's formerly was with the New York Times, wrote for Sports Illustrated, the Philadelphia Daily News, and KYW TV in Philadelphia. I'm sure our friend Steve Taylor will be very excited to have Robert Strauss on the show next week. Referencing Steve Taylor, we have, again, our great production team for the New York Times Read Along, Paula, Steve, Julia, and Carla. They do a great job every week sharing links to articles, doing quick Google searches as the conversation goes in different directions. And want to thank them, of course, for all of their great work on the New York Times Read Along. In Masters of Engagement, Elise, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. In addition to that, I want to give a special shout out to the Local Connection. The Local Connection is a weekly newsletter that comes out from the Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University. Each week, they offer story ideas and pro tips for journalists. And best of all, it's free. You can subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips, bit.ly/local news tips. And Carla Baranauckas puts out the Local Connection every week. So with that, Sri, we have included another great show. Thank you again for joining us. You get a little bit of a break before jumping on She's on Call with our colleagues Rose Horowitz, Vandana Menon, and Julia Weeks, helping you on that show. Of course,
they do all the work, and it's just great to work with everyone. By the way, Neil, I didn't get to show, but in the New York Times Magazine, there's a recommendation section: how to apologize to children. And I was kind of scared to read that myself because I don't like apologizing to my children. But you may want to know about what that's all about.
I was going to say, but the fact of the matter is that we often do have to apologize to children, and we need to acknowledge that we're not perfect, and sometimes we either make mistakes in our own life or even in interactions with them. If we get angry, at the wrong moment, etc. So that is definitely worth checking out. What I'd like to do is to close by showing people your Sunday note. This week it went out just before the New York Times Read Along started. Just give us a little preview of what's in the Sunday note, Sri.
Sure. Thank you very much. Please check this out. It's on Substack, Srinet, on Substack, srinet.substack.com. And today we're talking about cancel culture and how it's not really a thing. the way the right has portrayed it, and lots of things to read in there, including Bob Anthony's terrific tech tip every week. So that you'll get something to watch, something to read, and also a tech tip. So please subscribe if you haven't already, srinet.substack.com. And this is just a fun little image at the top which says, all right, this week we've got to cancel Lil Nas X and Nike, total boycott. And so somebody in a MAGA hat says, I thought we hated canceling things. Not canceling things is so last week, says one of those folks. So,
and of course, it's always a question of who's doing the canceling and what's getting canceled that will affect your.
Well, we
your
saw how
opinion on
bad
that.
a job Trump did with canceling Coca-Cola. He called for a boycott, but now multiple photographs have shown up of him drinking Coke, trying to hide that he's still got his Coca-Cola addiction.
Of course. But with that, again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And I want to thank Andrew in particular for continuing to put notes into his Facebook feed to help watch viewers. And if you joined us halfway, as soon as we're done in just a few moments, the video will be available on the same channels on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on YouTube. With that, thank you very much and have a great weekend.